Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 211th edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And as I say, every week we produce a video and also we do a podcast. So those of you watching on video will notice that there are three on the screen. So we're joined today by Beena Puri today. Hello, Beena.
Hi,
Hi.
Ben.
Hello, thank you for joining us. We'll get round to who is Beena and what does she do in a minute. But we always go to Stan. How are you? Oh, Stan, that top is not the usual top, is it? That's quite an important top you're wearing today.
It's a Salford Red Devils top, and I'm wearing it today because I'm hoping, fingers crossed, there'll be an announcement to say that some entrepreneur has decided to buy the club and save it from dramatic failure.
Right.
So there's supposed to be an announcement today. So
Is it Qatari money or is it?
no, it's the rumor is it's Australian money.
Oh, right,
Mm.
right.
So
Well, as a fan of Southend United that was bailed out by an Australian entrepreneur last year, I mean that's worked out quite well to be honest, because Southend United would have gone bust. But what did happen though, Stan, and I hope this happens for Salford, is we ended up with local business people wanting to get involved, and so it,
well,
the Australian entrepreneur led a group of local.
right, I was going to say because Salford last year did a community thing where technically I'm an owner of of
Oh,
Salford because
a cooperative.
yeah, it was a community. They called it a community-owned club at that point, so everybody could pay like 25 quid to get a share in the new company, and that was quite challenging, but it was made it different, and people were interested in it. But it clearly didn't raise enough money to
Uh,
run an expensive organization, so it kind of I don't know what happens to my ownership when somebody buys it out, whether I get my money back or
That's a
well,
very interesting model, though, isn't
it
it?
is,
it
yeah.
was, and it was based around the co-op actually, because I think at the time the co-op were willing to match fund whatever was raised by the community group
Oh, right,
in
right.
order to support community-led organisations. But it fell down because the stadium at the time didn't belong to them. It belonged half to Salford Council and half to Peel Holdings.
Right,
Well,
right.
Salford Council now have bought it all, and they are saying that Salford can manage and run it. So it's the equivalent of it being Salford Stadium now.
Right,
So
right. Now,
hopefully,
Bina, Stan mentioned the co-op. That's how we met, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, many, or not many.
Many moons ago,
Um,
it feels.
So, Bina, there will be a few people who don't know who you are. Do you want to just tell us who you are and what you're doing and what you have done?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Beena Puri. Amongst many hats worn, I suppose, I work for Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Um, I come from a background of tech. I started my career in the video games industry, back before, I suppose, dare I say it, Facebook and social media in the way that it is now.
So,
And
how
it,
did you get into video? I was interested how people land themselves in these sorts of jobs. Was that something you went to university to do? Was it?
no, no, not at all. I've got a squiggly career, as you might want to call it. So it was my first kind of office role outside of university. And I joined a video games publisher, and I stayed there about 8.5 years.
Oh, wow.
But I ended as a kind of marketing and PR manager. And it was really interesting because when I joined, the whole focus around publishing games was around, adverts in magazines. And I basically had to bring that, to the real world now. And I suppose some of the learnings, and I'm sure we'll talk about it or we're seeing it now, is if you don't adapt as a business into, at that time they were doing box games and Sainsbury's and HMV and all of those kind of stores that existed. If you didn't adapt, then you die. It was kind of,
Mm,
the role of digital was taking over, and you couldn't, you had to go with the audience. You had to adapt in terms of your marketing, in terms of considering the audience. And I think the interesting thing about digital is it's a two-way dialogue between brands and their customers. It's not just brands talking to their customers. So really kind of rethinking the role of organizations in the digital world. We've seen that now, haven't we?
yeah.
But it was a really interesting time, and I suppose that's what got me into the love around technology and digital and how it sort of changed conversations.
So where did you go then after that? What happened after the 8.5
So
years?
after that, I left London, came to Manchester, and I worked at another tech company, Brother, with a huge marketing team. And then after that, I kind of thought I want to do more than kind of marketing, and I wanted to do something with more impact.
Right.
And that's when I joined the Federation, which was a kind of community. It was a co-working space in a building with big tech companies like ThoughtWorks, Co-op Digital, Equal Experts in the same space as social enterprises, startups, organisations like Open Data Manchester, that was all kind of focused around tech for good, kind of supporting communities, and getting more girls into tech, the kind of ethical tech debate. And I thought that was really interesting because there's a lot of fantastic organizations, tech organizations doing really innovative things. And then it's about how do we match make that with people that need to understand, or people that are trying to look at ways to do those things. And I think bridging the gap has always been a thing that I've been really interested in doing, because it's about joining the dots and connecting people. But it really kind of showed the power of the tech organizations, but also communities in owning and taking responsibility and looking at kind of what does it mean to be responsible business in this, increasingly digital society. And way back when, one of the conversations, one of the we had a kind of thought leader, a tech thought leader that came to the Federation, and we did a kind of series of events, and she put it to us, or her talk was focused around what does it mean to be human in a tech focused world. And that always stuck with me, because I think it comes to where are we today, and I think that's a really increasingly important conversation.
Yeah. So I mean, that federation is interesting. There were, as you said, there were a few on some of the levels, quite large businesses. Were North Coders there?
North Coders, yeah, that's where they were born. So
Yeah. So,
yeah,
but also there was that sort of much smaller businesses, one or two individuals just working. I think that's where I saw also at the co-op this sort of sense of collaboration and connecting with each other, that people were very open to sharing an idea or resolving a problem that somebody else had, a
yeah,
much more less of a closed environment, much more of a solution focused, and it didn't really matter who came up with the solution as long as the solution worked. So I found it
yeah.
really quite yeah, invigorating is probably the word for me.
It was part of nudge theory.
Was it?
That to well, the bit of nudge theory that matches cooperation between different people was a hospital where there were too many deaths, and they didn't understand why they were in this hospital, and they analysed it, and the answer was move the coffee machines.
Really?
Because the coffee machines, the surgeons had their own coffee machine, the junior doctors had their own, and they moved the coffee machines so that they had to mix and have what now everybody calls coffee machine moments, or where you talk to somebody, and that talking and passing on information and making people think differently was about making people interact when they're with people they don't normally interact with.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
fascinating.
Nudge theory
it's
is really quite interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
it is.
Little
It,
tiny solutions to something that's not obvious.
and that's a really interesting one. You wouldn't have come up with that.
No,
You
no,
wouldn't have just come up with that and thought that it could be that simple.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit around creating those moments where you've got those water cooler moments.
yeah,
Where the best conversations you have is in the kitchen when you're making a cup of tea or coffee. and really kind of interacting with people that you would never have interacted with, that come from any organisation. And I suppose it's taken away your organisational hat and just being you and having these interesting conversations around your day, what you're working on. And I suppose that's where the innovation happens in my mind. It's where you're sharing thoughts.
Well, my friend who runs a group of psychologists who run Mindflick, which I often mention on here, that work with people to make them think differently. Their office was laid out with a big bench at a big table at one end, which they called the kitchen table. And when you came in to discuss things, that's where you sat as a group round the kitchen table and had those kind of conversations. And then after that, you moved to some big leather chairs on sort of one-to-one basis, and then finally to a formal area where you were planning and designing where you would go next.
It's amazing. That's the Federation, wasn't it?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
Exactly I can still picture that old wooden table on one of the floors. There were sort of individual little areas for a couple of comfortable seats.
Yeah, and that was it. I think. Do places make people? Do people make places? And it was really interesting because when you create those pockets, and I suppose it comes down to the nudge theory that you mentioned, Stan, around relocating the coffee machines. It's a place to bring people together. It's actually an environment that, with the dying out of co-working spaces, and now I suppose it's a kind of rejuvenation of co-working spaces post-pandemic, where people are trying to create those environments to bring businesses and people together for this reason, and for people to feel that sense of community and really get those kind of magic moments and the what more, the so what out of it. And I think that could lead to, and it has led to, some really interesting and fascinating work. And obviously North Coders is one of those pieces that kind of, because of the impact of that and because of the impact of having the Co-op Foundation on that floor, you were able to link in with Innovate Her, which, to see where they could play a pace with getting more girls into technology just by those, water cooler conversations.
Well, Nudge's more famous one is the Amsterdam airport. Do you know that one? Where the gents' toilets were a disgrace, and everything Amsterdam airport tried to do to solve it, including because they decided it was because men were rushing and not being as accurate as they might be. And so they even changed flight times and things like that to try and stop it. And Nudge Theory did it by putting little pictures on the urinal. And you'll see now a fly or a spider or something. Because once that was
Can
there,
I say, when we started the Frankenstein chat, I never thought we were going to get there.
It improved men's aim. It gave them something to aim at, and that solved the issue. It solved the problem. As simple as that.
Just to finish off where you are now, then. So what you're currently involved in at the moment?
From a work perspective, so I'm part of the digital team for Greater Manchester. So we lead the digital strategy for the region. The region means where we work in partnership with our 10 boroughs. A couple of hats that I wear. Well, I used to lead the cyber advisory group, which was the ecosystem, the cyber ecosystem, the strong cluster we've got in Greater Manchester. And then the other hat that I wear is I lead the digital inclusion agenda, which is a big part of our digital strategy, because we're focused around how digital is an enabler for better, more efficient public services, for businesses, for life. But the other part of that is that responsibility around recognising where it could be a disabler, and how do we empower people in an increasingly digital society. And that's where the focus around digital inclusion, social inclusion plays a huge part. And we were talking about it earlier, weren't we, Frank, and around inequalities. And if you don't have a specific focus and action around that, then you don't have, it falls within gaps, and it falls within gaps of teams that actually aren't well placed to really focus on the broader context of things like digital inequalities.
Yeah, because often I don't like the word disadvantage, but say poorer members or the people who don't have a voice, they're often missed out on this sort of issue, aren't they? That the people that are shouting the loudest tend to be the ones that have got more going for them. You know, they've got more advantage, whether that's economic or whether that's influence or people they know. But it's the people
Yeah,
that don't have a voice that, and I suppose economically for regenerating the region, you know, it's probably those that we need to really support, you know, to enable them to feel actively involved and to connect back into work or to feel as though they've got a meaningful life, you know, and able to engage with all of this.
absolutely. I mean, it's about how do we include people and recognizing. So we did a resident survey. We've been doing it kind of quarterly. And the interesting thing, and it's a bit like the census and how they captured information, there needed to be an offline version, and those people needed support to be able to fill out those forms. And that's important, regardless of whether there are digital options, always to have another option. And it's absolutely, as you say, Frank, it impacts your ability to participate, to have economic participation for whatever reason you are not online. So it's not just those that we say are disadvantaged, but you are disadvantaged in some way if you don't have the connectivity, the internet connectivity at home, or access to it. If you don't have the skills, and the resident survey, it was at one point it was online, and it's interesting how the answers changed. So the only people that were of privilege to have that digital skills and the ability to fill in those surveys, their voices were heard. And they so for the next rounds, they had people knocking on doors.
Oh, right.
And that's really interesting too, because you're not just getting people that can fill out paperwork, you're actually going and understanding where people are. And there's some people that can't get out of the house for different reasons, mobility issues or other reasons. There are people that need help to fill out forms or to understand how they should or could participate in. And I suppose it's given people an equal right, and having that equality of access. That if you don't have a non-digital perspective, then your survey is only really representative of those that are online. And again, it presents a very different picture of life.
I think it's Google. I might be wrong that it's Google, but Google did a lot of work on successful meetings and what makes a good team and everything. And they suggested you should always have an empty chair in your team meeting that represents those people who don't have access to what you're talking about. And then you refer to the empty chair as saying, well, what would somebody in that empty chair be saying about what we're saying?
It
It just
reminds
brings
me.
a thought to people's teamwork that there are other people there that they don't see, invisible on the empty chair.
Well, it's a very interesting one. It comes back to the conversations we have in tech in terms of who's in the room and who is developing. Who are you developing technology services for? And there's a really interesting person called Christina. Caroline Criado, and she wrote a book, and it was basically around examples of where people were not included in producing that technology. Some of the famous ones that you might know of is seatbelts that were modelled on smaller versions of the masculine body, who have a different kind of hip kind of size or length and width. And in a recent example of a car accident, it wasn't those that were at the front, the kind of father and son that was at the front. It was the mother and daughter at the back that got most impacted because, again, it's not modelled around female bodies. And that's the other challenge around testing and around technology. It's not just that empty chair, but probably filling that empty chair with the people that we're trying to reach. Because without that, we're looking at things in our perspective and with the context of our life and our thinking, rather than
Wow.
the kind of context of other people's lives and how they think. And that's a really interesting
I have to say,
example.
I'm groaning here because yesterday I phoned Virgin. We're not going to get onto what caught our eye this week. I can feel it. I phoned Virgin yesterday. It's about that seat, the Stands Point, because they wanted to increase my monthly payment by about £40. Now, we have the top end system, all right? We love sport. We can do Zoom with this sort of broadband connection that we have here. But actually, I was then complaining about, or not complaining, but sort of challenging them about a £25 increase. And when I wasn't able to resolve it, they said, well, if you wait another few days, you come into another window, you're likely to get a slightly better price. But it made me think, £25. There are so many families that haven't got a decent connection, haven't even got a connection, haven't got a device to use. And here I am moaning about having to pay £25 more for the top end system that gives me, I don't know, football from Argentina, gives me sort of like, I can do these Zoom calls, I can have loads of people on this line, and I'm thinking I've completely lost sight of, where I am compared to other people within society who aren't as well. It's about wealth, isn't it? Who can't afford to have that
and access, because
access.
if you go to your caravan like I do, Frank, and you can't get a signal, you realise how desperate you are without a signal.
The caravan in Benlek in Anglesey, it has the worst broadband connection. But actually, that's a really something that Melansko said at a conference yesterday, was that he did some work in America, and he said there are swathes of North America, that have absolutely no broadband connection whatsoever. And you think, well, Silicon Valley's over there, but there's a massive divide in America between those who have and those who don't, just in terms of broadband.
Yeah, and absolutely, there are assumptions that you will be online, and I think Stan, you kind of mentioned that earlier around, the banks and your
I could say that now.
Go ahead.
It's going to be what's caught my eye. But my sister lives on the island of Kos it's only a small island in Greece, and she has a bank account. The bank account turns out is a joint bank account that she didn't realise. She thought it was hers, and so she wanted to have access to digital banking, and they needed an address. Well, her address in this small island is the name of the town. That's it. They don't have postcodes. They don't have street names. The residents, the post comes into a box I think it's in the sort of council building, and everybody goes in on a Tuesday and Thursday and roots through it and finds any post that's addressed to them. Not the most secure, except, but they also have a post office box, but that's in the main town, which is quite a distance away. But the bank couldn't give her digital access because she didn't have an address that they could put on. And she said, but my husband is the other part of this, and he can have digital banking, and you write to him at this address. Well, we can't. We need an address. Is there somebody else we can write to and share their address? So she said, yeah, it's you can write to my accountant. Oh, that's great. What's his address? Kefalos. Like everybody else who lives here, that's their address. And it got farcical. I mean, she has a pension from the same bank because she used to work for them, and that gets paid in. So, and it was just simply, I suspect that the person trying to fill the form in online at the bank in England couldn't because it didn't have a postcode. And when you don't enter the postcode into the box, it won't let you proceed to the next stage. So it's that, for me, it was the nonsense in, if you like, of we can't do this for you because we can't have an address, but yet we send stuff to you anyway by another. So we have got your name, we have got an address for you. It just won't fit on this particular form. So the last I heard, they were moving it to the exemptions team or something, the alternative addresses team, so they could do something about it. But I mean, we did try to give her a sort of an address here, and that, I won't go into the details, but that caused absolute mayhem when somebody said, "But you've got more people than you say living in this address."
Right.
But that could
Again,
just be that could just be software development, isn't it? And the sort of restrictions of
well,
requiring.
it's an assumption, isn't it? It's an assumption that there is a postcode.
Yeah.
There isn't a postcode. There should be a way. There should be a loop around it to say, in this circumstances, we have to do something different. But that's not been
My
thought
son's
through.
involved in user experience. He'd be all over that, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
I think that's it really. It's banks kind of catching up with considering that it's not just those that are online or those that have a postcode. Who are their customers? And I suppose they can be proactive in that way. And you've seen that in terms of how banks have had to adapt their services because of considering those that can't access them. And just in terms of those that can access technology and the focus around digital first, and kind of having an app being the first or the way that you need to engage with your bank. And we've had examples of, or I've heard from some of community groups in Greater Manchester where they say, and they might be based in a coffee shop, and they say, you know, some of our residents come to us because they need to access their bank. So actually they're passing information to strangers, and it is a huge security risk as well.
And
but
usually in, say, coffee shops, open access, you know, it's not a closed internet connection, is it?
No. Yeah, and again, it's you're passing your personal details to, you know, so it's how can banks and that whole service help to support people in a safe way, given that we know that not everyone can access, you know, things through an app. And I think there's a risk. And one thing that we don't necessarily talk about is what is the risk of people not being able to access. And I think, Stan, you kind of made that point earlier. But Frank, if I just might come back to your point around broadband and the costs. So just looking at digital exclusion and kind of what that means, it's people that don't have the skills or the ability to, or the access to get online, or the support to get online. And with that in mind, you know, there is a role here for organisations. And I think we're able to have conversations now than we weren't able to kind of 5 years ago, pre-pandemic, to say, actually, have you thought about, or we need to think about people that can't afford your services, that without which, if they can't get broadband at home, children aren't able to continue their learning. They can't turn up to school because they cannot get online. People can't continue to look for their jobs, get benefits, get that kind of social support if they can't get online. And that's obviously there was the huge kind of impact around mental well-being, and local authorities, their community hubs that they set up, the conversations they were having with people were, have you eaten anything today? Have you spoken to anyone this week? And recognizing that is an opener to understanding the why and I suppose the role of technology, WhatsApp, you know, things like that, which could help you to see your family, but is now an increasing kind of way that people might get online, especially with loneliness and other challenges around getting out of the house. And just quickly on that, so in Greater Manchester, we've got so we're 2.8 million people. 1 out of 5 residents live in social housing, and we know from research that residents in social housing do not have more than £30 to £35 of disposable income at the end of the month. And obviously, if they're looking to pay for connectivity, people are having to choose between food, fuel, and internet connectivity. And I think that's the bit, if it's a lifeline, if it's the way for you to participate, to you know, you're paying less for shopping because you can access price comparison sites, you know, things like that. So naturally that extra £20 to £25 or social tariffs, which are from internet providers that can provide connectivity, say for £15 a month. £15 a month for me is very different to £15 a month for others. And that's what the cost is. But again, Frank, just coming back to your point, it shouldn't be the point where you're saying, I'm going to leave your service to get the best offer. And for you, waiting a couple of days for a cheaper service doesn't feel right, does it?
That's how I felt as a customer as
That's
well. And I've been with Virgin for 30 odd years.
yeah.
Actually,
This
I felt as
really
though
winds me up. It
if
really does.
if I'd stepped out and gone to Sky and then come back to Virgin, I think I would have got a really good deal.
Yeah.
It's as if your loyalty counts for absolutely nothing,
It doesn't, Frank. But what gets me, and it's in lots of places, but if you go to buy a car and you get well, I can do you this deal, I can do you this deal. Well, I can't afford that. Well, let me see if I can make it even better. So buying cars for the family a few years ago, I ended up going into a place and saying, look, I want to know how much this car is. If you at some point in the next hour or so tell me you can do it cheaper, I'm walking out. So I want to know now what the bottom line is. That's all I want to know, and I'll decide then whether or not to buy it. If you come with anything then after that saying, oh, but I could probably do, I'm out. So it's the same with like the Sky, all those organisations. I'm thinking of leaving. Okay, well, we'll reduce it by £60 a month for the next 6 months. Okay, I'll stay.
I think just on the digital exclusion, we're not going to get what's called our eye here. I think we have with yours, Beena. We've covered some of that area, but there is I think is it EE or probably all the main providers do actually have or they promote a sort of digital exclusion tariff where they can use people's unused payment that they've made for connectivity. They can dish that to other people. I find it really quite. I struggle to know why we even think about that. That actually, in effect, what digital businesses are saying is that you pay your £20, you might only use £10 of it. We'll keep the £10. That £10 actually belongs to me. I've paid for that, even though I've not used it. And actually, I should then be able to say there should be a national pot that I can go online and say I want my spare money to go into this pot. So that actually can be used to provide digital access to everybody in social housing. I'm paying for something and they keep what's left. They keep the change. That seems completely wrong.
Because I'm very old, I can remember when we first got a telephone, we had what was called a party line.
We had one
shared with your next door neighbour.
Not too young to remember this, Beena, but we used to be able to listen
with a party line. So when you wanted to use the phone, you pressed a button on the top, and that gave you of you and your neighbour, that gave you the priority to use the phone. I'm sure there is a way they could do some sort of sharing with digital that was meant the cost was halved between two neighbours or two relatives. And you say, well, you might not, well, the broadband speed might be such that you can't both download stuff at the same time or stream, but you can certainly both use it at the same time.
Well, there's some interesting models around that, actually. There was a recent organisation that I was speaking to, and they provide connectivity in football stadiums. And one of the things that they do or look to do is when the football stadium is not in use, how can that connectivity support the communities nearby? And I think there's some interesting kind of concepts there around what more could we do that probably hasn't been explored in a way that is a whole sector approach, but it's very much kind of individual organisations coming up with these innovative ways of usage and connecting up communities. So yes, I think there's a bit of catching up to do.
I was going to say, if Old Trafford's the example, there's a lot they've got to do yet. You need to be about what, half a mile away from Old Trafford before you can get a signal.
Just one thing though, I mean, if we can wrap it up here, is we talk about the digital divide. Stan and I have spoken many times on this chat about um, how is education, I don't mean just schools, but how is education preparing the future society, adults within society, for a very different sort of world. And we seem to be a little bit transfixed by doing things the way they've always been done. Instead of looking for something slightly different, adapting. I mean, how optimistic are you about the future for the region, future for young people moving into this world? You know, are we still going to have these similar discussions in another 10, 20 years' time, but we're just a different group of people who are disadvantaged from, not having access? How optimistic are you?
I think that's an interesting one, Frank, isn't it? Are we going to unpick the education system and where we'll be in sort of 10 and 20 years' time? Technology is changing, and the fact is, young people are in this world. It's not a future world, it's where we are now. And there's different elements around education and helping young people to stay safe online. And we know from some of our surveys with young people that the concerns around them is online bullying, child sexual exploitation, things like that. And those are the key things that we will increasingly need to talk about. And I suppose the question is, where do they get taught? Where do they, so optimism is, I suppose we can only live in hope, but if we do something about it, if inaction is not going to get us anywhere. And I think that's where the online safety bill has come in. But there's a disconnect between putting something out nationally and actually how is that put in place at a very local and hyper-local level. And we know that some schools' ability to provide that support, to provide that learning and knowledge is different. And we know that because we've heard teachers don't necessarily have those skills to be able to confidently kind of engage with technology in the way that is needed. So optimism is definitely there. We're not going to be in a utopian society, but it's how do we build the foundations to keep up to pace with that change.
It's interesting just to finish that. Yesterday I was talking to, as part of an event, Professor Melansko, and he was talking about actually how you can sort of ensure that you get an inclusive education experience that actually addresses current needs as well as future needs. And he identified Estonia and Portugal as places that were particularly inclusive. And he drew out that quite interesting point about, it was about 25, 30 years ago that Portugal had a revolution. And of course, Estonia, being part of the former Russian Empire, also went through a similar sort of revolution. So in effect, what happened in those countries is that they had a position where, well, what's education going to look like? What do we want Estonians, Portuguese young people to get? And the point being that we haven't had that. We have had a very sort of long period of time where things build up, and we don't have that sort of overall, let's wipe the slate clean and think about again, what do we need to do? So I think that's quite an interesting point he was making about, sometimes those revolutions have actually proved quite productive for moving forward.
But I think it's important to understand the context as well, because Estonia, they have a digital citizenship, a digital identity. They're smaller than, Greater Manchester's bigger than Estonia, and their ability, they've had 20 years plus of building this digital culture, and we don't necessarily have that in the UK. And I think there is progress, but it does need to also come from a leadership level. There's interesting case studies, interesting best practice, but it's we're not ever starting from scratch. We're starting from the systems in which we sit.
Yeah.
Well, there's an old joke, isn't there, about somebody asking about going to a football match and stopping the car and saying, can you tell me how I'd get to United, let's say? And the guy says, well, I wouldn't start from here.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Beena. That's actually we went on for 40 minutes, so thank you very much. It's been a really fascinating chat,
Yeah,
and
really
we've
good.
actually gone down some avenues that we haven't gone down before. So that's really good for somebody this is the 211th edition. So thank you for doing that.
No, thank you for having me.
No,
It's
no,
been
no,
lovely to speak. I'm
no.
sure we can talk for Britain, can't we?
Well, I'm sure.
Sure we can.
Uh, and yeah, we for the next couple of weeks we have a number of guests lined up as well, and we're looking forward to their insight. So thank you. I hope you all have a great week, and we'll be back next Friday morning. So until then, cheerio. Bye bye.
Take
Bye.
care. See you later.